Thank you very much, and great to be here and have the opportunity to talk to you. What I'm going to talk to you today about is the topic of new currencies in procurement. New currencies means for us the obvious need to rethink what procurement and what, in particular, also supply chain leaders overall need to think about in terms of the future expectations and value optimization areas. When we look at what's going on in the world, we see actually a lot of change. I'm not talking to you about something that is brand new and surprising, but just to give a little bit some facts behind what we currently see every day. The number of global exports that will be coming from different countries in 5 years from now will be 20% of the total exports. We look at the volatility of commodities, right? The example, for example, of paper pulp, dropping by 40% in 2020, now increasing by 150% in 2022. And we all remember the time when the oil price was zero, you remember? But other things are changing as well. The frequency of the disruptions. We at McKinsey, we analyzed in more detail how often and how intense are the disruptions to supply chains. And it's not only that the number of disruptions, and there have been many, right? It's not only the Ukraine situation, it has also been previously in certain parts of the world when there was earthquakes, there was the channel was closed. You remember all of these things. And based on this, we realized that the number of things that procurement needs to deal with are increasing significantly, and also the areas where procurement can create value, they expand significantly. In the traditional world, it was relatively easy, right? At the end of the day, procurement was measured on what have we spent last year and what are we spending next year. Ideally, net comparison. So what's really in the P&L? In the future, we are realizing that there is a lot of change. There's a lot of additional areas where procurement can actually create value. For example, the famous term of cost avoidance. I remember when many people said cost avoidance is not a good term, right? We shouldn't talk about cost avoidance. I remember one of an automotive CPO told me in 2020 when I spoke to him and asked him, what are you doing with all of the raw materials dropping now? What are you doing? How are you dealing with it? He said, not doing anything. It's market. It's not my responsibility, right? 2 years later, he says, this is the most important driver for us to understand how can we actually better predict and outperform the market. So market cost and cost avoidance is a relevant value driver. Another important dimension that has changed is the look on the supplier portfolio. We are seeing a lot of attention to what type and where are you having your suppliers. We call it the multi-culture view, right? Making sure it's diversified. Suddenly, single sourcing is a risk, right? In the past, it was good because you bundle volumes, you have better price most likely. But the supplier portfolio diversification is a relevant driver for procurement. And then, of course, the big one, the new value dimension, is all about sustainability. I recently spoke to one of the big CapEx investment companies in Germany, and the clients there told me, Jan, the key challenge for us is to find what we call win-win idea, right? And of course, in many countries, like for example in Germany, where I'm from, if you're in a public sector company, you need to focus on cost reduction. That's the main decision criteria for suppliers. Not, for example, yet around CO2 reduction, but this is supposed to come. So CO2 as a new dimension and currency becomes relevant. And then last but not least, the entire end-to-end perspective. We've invested a lot in research in how do procurement organizations change their role, and there is many who meanwhile move from a procurement price negotiation view to an end-to-end optimization. How do I actually look at the entire supply chain? And the famous example that we see these days in food and beverage companies, right? How suddenly companies change their offering portfolio depending on how the input factors are changing. Huh? If oil price go up, that means you actually go for certain parts of your food portfolio that actually has less oil and maybe other ingredients. So what I'm saying is there is a huge shift in terms of the currencies and the dimensions where procurement can and should create value. If we look at this a little bit more in detail and with a concrete example. This here is the example of a consumer goods player in the food space, roughly 500 million revenues, just to give you a sense. And what they typically achieved in procurement was the traditional net savings, 2%, sometimes 3% per year, right? What has changed now is, on the right side, the different order of magnitude that the procurement organization can address, right? If they just look at the energy cost increase and assuming they can actually avoid 25% of that, that would already have helped them significantly. If they are able to address loss in sales because they improve availability of some ingredients, that's another, in this case, 25 million. They also have a calculation how much worth is a ton of CO2. If they reduce CO2 by 10%, that's another 4 million. And then there is also, so to say, what they call the supplier health index, meaning how can we actually balance the right supply portfolio to make sure we don't run in any risk. So what you see is the amount of value that procurement has traditionally been responsible for or could be basically addressed is sometimes changing in a factor of 10, maybe even sometimes 15 times higher. So the question, of course, is, how do you get there? How do you actually achieve these value dimensions? And in order to get, so to say, the coins in the casino, we believe you need to actually have a certain set of interesting cards to play or levers where we believe procurement can really make a difference. And I will, in the next couple of minutes, walk you a little bit what are these drivers or levers where procurement create value. The first one is, we call it the 360 resilience check. So this moves from a classical category strategy work to a much more real-time 360 view, how well am I prepared for the different risks out there. The second big dimension is the supplier resilience archetypes, we call it. How can you actually make sure that you have in your portfolio a right balance of suppliers who are in particular inflation protected? The worst thing that would happen for you is that a supplier comes to you and says, I have increased cost, either you take it or I can't supply you. That's what we need to avoid. So supplier portfolio is a big lever. The third one, that's the little bit more of an organizational topic. We are realizing already since 2 or 3, 4 years that there's a big shift to introducing more pools in the procurement organization. So less category-specific workers and people and buyers, more flexible pools. And we see that these pools now become a completely new relevance in the context of resilience and having resilience pool as people who can help you with dealing in the current situation. The fourth card to play, an important one from our side, is that procurement needs to move from being a spend manager, basically looking at what you buy, to a margin manager, right? So what's the end-to-end view of the implications that I have on pricing and availability? And the last but not least is, of course, the spend cube is, I think, something that every procurement company has been built up or is in the process of building up. But the spend cube is very often a static spend cube. You update what are you buying today or what have you bought last year. This needs to get much more dynamic. Dynamic cost models, really understanding what is the different drivers that actually change my portfolio. Let me go into a little bit more details and become concrete. First one, 360 degree of resilience check. The traditional category strategy will in the future become much less relevant of an annual long-term strategy and is in particular these days much more short-term oriented towards a 360-degree resilience. What do I mean by this? Very often, many of the organizations I work with, they traditionally said once a year we update our category strategy. We look at the supplier portfolio for the future, the demand portfolio, product strategy from the company, and based on this and risk, based on this, develop our future category strategy. We realize that these days, first of all, it needs to be done much more often, the review, right? Once a year is no longer enough. And secondly, it needs to include significantly different dimensions. What is the real short-term availability outlook of the category? What are the sustainability elements that we need to potentially take into consideration? How resilient is my supply base, right? Is there any risk, stability, financial stability risk? Also what we call glocalization, right? The right balance of global suppliers and local suppliers. This traditional rule of our supply base needs to have, for example, China plus one structure, right? Whenever you have a Chinese supplier, you need a second alternative in case something happens in the supply chain on the logistics side. Or substitutions alternatives. So in case this product is not available, what's my next best alternative? What else can I do to still ensure we can produce or run our processes and services? So you see there is a big shift in terms of the category strategy getting new elements. So that's the first card. The second big dimension where procurement can create value these days in the future is looking differently at your supplier portfolio. In the past, traditionally, you were typically asking questions on your supplier portfolio on two dimensions. Do you have global supplier, or do you have local supplier? So is it best cost country, high cost country? That's one of the big questions we always discussed, right? And the other thing we often discussed is where do we have monopolistic suppliers versus basically a buyer market where I actually have a lot of alternatives. We're realizing this is changing now. What you need to look at in the future is archetypes, making sure that you understand how well the suppliers are inflation protected. And we, in that context, typically differentiate three types of suppliers that you can find. The one is what we call the inflation protected supplier. That's obviously ideal, protected supplier. My traditional example is of a railway company, right? A railway company buys trains and runs them for 30 or 50 years, right? Or produce tracks and build tunnels and then operate them for 50 years. So the cost is pretty predictable, but the prices you can adjust depending on what happens in the world, right? So that's actually quite inflation protected. There's also many throughput suppliers. We call it inflation throughput. They basically have an index with many of their customers saying, if my input factors go up, then I also can raise prices with my customers. So they are also, to some extent, well positioned in the inflation context. The tricky one and the risky one are, we call it the sandwich suppliers. Sandwich means your costs go up in times of inflation, but their prices are somehow fixed. And in that situation, they are obviously running into a big risk, right? We've seen it with gas trading utilities, right? They have fixed contracts with customers, and costs go up, and you see how many they now need financial support from governments. But there's many other suppliers you can think of. So the sandwich suppliers are the big ones to watch out for, and procurement can play an important role to anticipate which are those and how many of those are there. It is in that context very important not only to understand your tier 1 structure of these archetypes, but the tier 2 and tier 3. This here is an example that we actually did for a transformer. So this was for an energy company, and they obviously buy a lot of transformers, being very important these days, and of course in the future. And we analyzed how many suppliers do they have on the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 level. And you see they have basically 670 tier 1 suppliers. Transformer is a very complex product, and 6,000 tier 2 and tier N. And what we then looked at is how many suppliers, we call them, are highly interconnected. So these are tier 2, tier 3 suppliers who serve multiple tier 1s. That's the bulk risk, right? There is one of these underlying tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. If they actually have a financial problem or an availability problem, this actually hits several of your tier 1 suppliers, right? In this case, this was about 35 highly interconnected and 310 mid-interconnected. So what it means is procurement, when procurement leaders can understand what is the underlying risk on tier 2, tier 3 level in your supply base, this helps you to very well anticipate how big are potential bulk risks in your overall portfolio. That was the second big topic and value dimension. The third one I already mentioned earlier is this topic of pools. And maybe to give a little bit of a context to this. Procurement traditionally has very often an organization by categories, right? You have buyers for direct categories, for indirect categories, depending on industry you work with. Now, many organizations already installed in the past kind of agile pools, meaning not everyone is organized by categories, but some are in a flexible pool and then get staffed wherever the biggest projects are, the biggest RFQs are. And this is a big shift. Now, in the future, you need not only agile people for negotiations and RFQs, you need probably more people in that pool also for resilience tasks. And you can see that the type of things that procurement buyers need to deal with these days is significantly changing, right? Market dynamics, understanding risk assessments, much different than the portfolio in the past. And because of this, we realize that also the structure of procurement people you need in your organization is changing. Yeah? On the left side, you see a little bit the traditional structure. Very often there's a split of 30-70, sometimes 40-60 of strategic buyers, so they do source to procure, and to operational buyers, procure to pay, right? It's roughly a 30-70. What happens in the future, and is a big driver, of course, to create additional value, is on the one side, to reduce the number of operational buyers by being more efficient, using more automation levers, bots, and things like this, and then reinvesting this capacity into a different set of strategic buyers. And strategic buyers, if you think about it, they actually are not only one type of strategic buyer, right? There is strategic buyers that are mainly creating their value by being the experts in a category. We call them the subject matter expertise buyers, the SME buyers, right? They are super good at understanding the supply market in that specific category. But then there's other strategic buyers who actually in reality are really making the difference by being creative. Always one step ahead of the suppliers, having new ideas, having alternative new tools. And then in addition, we see that there's a different profile happening now. And when you talk to even a lot of the headhunting companies, they realize there is a new demand for people in the procurement organizations who can deal with resilience, who can deal with IT, who can deal with analytics, who are having a much different profile than the classical negotiation experts. And there you see it's really like an end-to-end view of change leaders that you need to actually have combined in your pool of a procurement organization. So that's why you see that the type of people that we in the future see in the procurement organization is changing, and they can help you to actually address these additional levers. I'll give you a concrete example. What does it actually mean for these kind of people in the pool? You see here a little bit how a typical inflation curve looks like. This is an example of stainless steel. So this has already happened in the past. We hope it happens in other categories soon as well. Because what you see there is that there was, so to say, a pre-inflation and a shock period, and then after the plateau, the decrease. The reason why I'm showing this is that I think in the future this will help you to understand the different types of work you need to actually do in the organization. Yeah? So for example, the typical tactical activities, inflation management, inflation prediction is something you do in the beginning, but then over time it needs to be much more dynamic, right? In the shock period which we have in many industries these days, you need to look at dynamic clean sheets and nerve centers and different alternative supply sources. And when now the prices potentially go down, right? Make sure you have tools to actually anticipate clawback, different contracting types. So the shift of the levers of the procurement team are changing over time as inflation actually goes through different stages. And that's why this is an important thing element to also have different profiles. The fourth one is what we call the move from the spend manager to the margin manager. Traditionally, what has procurement been doing or is doing? Very often, you actually look at your supply chain, your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, and think about where do I buy from, at which prices, how long do I do contracts, and these kind of things. In the future, you will see many leading procurement organizations who understand themselves not as spend, but as margin managers. Margin manager means you look not only on your supplier side, but on the operations, logistics, even sales. Yeah? And when there is, for example, a shortage in some area, how do I thereby adapt my offering portfolio working together with the sales and marketing team? If there's a certain price increase on raw materials, how can I change my specification or adapt my product configuration? And you see the shift of focus, right? From a pure spend to an end-to-end margin manager. This is a big additional perspective where procurement can drive value these days. The fifth one is, and that becomes now a little bit more the technical side, looking not only at a traditional static spend cube, but actually at the dynamic spend model. What I mean by this is, traditionally, the procurement organization has only 3 main dimensions to deal with, right? You have some suppliers in your portfolio, you have some categories, and you have some products where these suppliers deliver into. So that's the typical 3 dimensions you have in a spend cube. What has already happened in the last years is many organizations realize I don't need only a spend cube that is procurement specific, but I need something that is cross operations, right? Including supply chain data, meaning not only where and from whom do I buy, but also what are the supply chains, what are the stock levels, what are also potential delivery costs, and other dimensions. Sales parameters, also manufacturing related. So this is something where many organizations already move from a procurement to a cross-functional operations data stack. But now, what happens these days is you need to get a significantly higher real-time information out of it, right? And thereby you need to do much more investments into a dynamic, we call it dynamic supply model. What is the real volatility? Where do I actually have which reaction time? How quickly, if a certain product or category is no longer available, how quickly can I resource, right? If a certain supply chain path becomes much more expensive, how quickly can I actually adjust? So the dynamic element that needs to be actually analyzed and interpreted is a very important new dimension. So if you're able to do that, that's another way how you can actually address potential levers. And that is something that we, for example, see many companies invest into. So here's a typical example how a cost model develops over time, right? In the past, you had maybe once a year an update of your contracts with suppliers, but now you need to actually move to what we call dynamic clean sheets. So understanding every month, how do my input factors change? How do actually my total cost structures change from the supplier? And therefore, what does it actually, at the end of the day, mean for my overall price that I currently pay? So this gave you hopefully a little bit of an overview of there are new currencies, new value dimensions where procurement can actually create benefits, much more than just the net savings. And we've talked a little bit about what are these levers to actually address and deliver on these value dimensions, right? One I talked about was the 360-degree resilience check, so moving from strategy to 360 degrees. I talked a little bit about the supplier archetypes, right? Moving beyond the traditional monopolistic BCC, local, global supplier discussion to a inflation view. Who is inflation protected? Who is in a sandwich position? I talked a little bit about the agile pool and how this needs to be expanded by the resilience pool. And then, indeed, on the more technical side, moving from a spend manager to a margin manager, from a spend cube to a dynamic supply model. And what it always means is that the requirements on the procurement organization is changing significantly, right? So the traditional profile and the traditional way how you actually see your value dimensions is massively changing. And because of this, we are also seeing that there's much more cross-functional change leaders needed in the procurement teams who actually are able to address these dimensions and actually help companies to employ these new levers. Hope this gave you a little bit of an overview of what we mean with the new currencies and what are the levers that we actually see to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. Always good to get some great insights on McKinsey. Now, among the new currencies that you're talking about there, which one would you say is the likely to be the most important one where procurement can generate the biggest additional value?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a difference between short term, the next 6 months, and maybe the next 2 years. I think in the next 2 years, it's very obvious from my point of view, it's the CO2 currency, right? So many see this really as a trade-off, right? Thinking about how much am I willing to invest for 1 kilogram or tons of CO2 savings? Short term, obviously, it is the supplier portfolio, right? The supplier risk, cultural, multicultural, making sure you really have a good view of where do I have which risks. When I talked about the tier 2, tier 3, high connectivity suppliers, that's, of course, short term the biggest the biggest value dimension that procurement can look at.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience, by the way? I do have some more here, but if anyone has a question, please put your hand up. Okay, yeah, we have one right in the centre there. If you can just start by stating your name and where you're from, please.
Sure. Daniel Abter from Arkiva. I thought that was brilliant, by the way, really, really clear and what you gave. And so my question would be, you obviously have an insight from a lot of companies you've been into and you've been able to apply this, but if someone doesn't have the backing of a large consultancy, how do you sell this into, let's say, the CFO? Because this is quite an investment. It's procurement doing something more than they would normally do, and it's hard for procurement to sort of say, well, I want to get involved with the sales cycle. So how do you see that being possible?
Yeah. So it's a little, you remember the example I've shown with the consumer company with the factor 9 higher at the beginning, my second slide? This is basically the translation of these new currencies in euros or dollars, right? Basically, for the CFO discussion, it still matters to make sure you understand what it means quantitatively, right? And that's, so to say, the way how we try to build the bridge. But I understand there are many situations where the CFO says, at the end of the day, what matters is of what I have in my P&L. But I think, I hope this illustrated a little bit how these dimensions will actually also have a financial impact beyond the traditional spend cost increase or decrease.
Okay, thank you for your question. Now, regarding the resilience pool as well, which you were talking about, which types of buyers or experts and capabilities will be needed, and where can we find these profiles?
Yeah, we actually see in particular many of the big companies, for example, large consumer corporations, they actually invest into dedicated resilience teams which have three main areas to deal with. One is transparency, meaning being able to really calculate what is the today's and future risk. So it's a different controlling function, if you want to say. Secondly, a risk capability, being able to assess where do I really have which risks in my supply base, in my portfolio. And the third one is a little bit of a new tools, right? You need to actually move from static cost models to dynamic cost models. You need to move from spend cube to end-to-end dynamic margin management, and thereby introducing new capabilities, new tools. And that's a little bit a new set of capabilities that these people need to bring to the party. And you need really different people, right? It's not the traditional person who stands up in the morning and is excited by negotiating another 2% from the supply base by being a tough negotiator. That's a different profile.
Okay, now as our audience said, it was a really great session and really clear. If anyone has any further questions, please do catch up with Jan directly, maybe in the networking after the show. For now, though, thank you so much, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you.